Welcome to Awake Us Now. Today's program is sponsored by Awake Us Now. And now, here's Pastor Dodge.
And so today we pick up where we had left off last time with the seventh and final of these woes. Matthew 23, verses 29 and 30. This is what Jesus said. Woe to you, teachers of the law and Pharisees, you hypocrites, you actors. You build tombs for the prophets and decorate the graves of the righteous. And you say, if we had lived in the days of our ancestors, we would not have taken part with them in the shedding the blood of the prophets. And then Jesus goes on. So you testify against yourselves that you are descendants of those who murdered the prophets. Go ahead then and complete what your ancestors started. These are powerful words, and they are powerful words in and of themselves, but they are powerful words particularly in light of what's going to happen in the next few days. Because as Jesus speaks these words of judgment over the religious leadership, he knows full well what lies ahead. He's been warning his disciples all along, namely, that he is going to be betrayed into the hands of the religious establishment. He will be turned over to the Romans, he will be crucified, and on the third day he will rise again. And so Jesus says of these teachers of the law and Pharisees, he says, go ahead then, complete what your ancestors started. In other words, your ancestors killed the prophets God sent. You boast that had you been living back then, you wouldn't have done that. But when you build the tombs and the memorials, you're basically saying, we're the same part of that bloodline. And Jesus says as a result, judgment is coming because you have rejected the Messiah. Your ancestors murdered the prophets, but now you will murder the very Son of the living God. And that's what lies behind this. And so Jesus says, verse 33, you snakes, you brood of vipers, how will you escape being condemned to hell? Again, Jesus is coming directly at them, and he is making it clear this is a life or death issue, and not just life or death in this world, life or death forever. You brood of vipers, he says. Therefore, I'm sending you prophets and sages and teachers. Now, think about that for a second. It's real easy to read over that, but look at that closely. Therefore, I am sending you prophets and sages and teachers. Note, he does not say the Father sent. He's saying, I send you. And it is, again, a very clear indication, as we have seen in various and sundry episodes throughout the Gospel of Matthew, Matthew revealing more and more about Jesus' identity as Jesus reveals more and more about his identity. And he's making it very clear. He is the true Son of the living God, true man, but the one who sent the prophets and the sages and the teachers. And he says, some of them you will kill and crucify. Others you will flog in your synagogues and pursue from town to town. And with that, Jesus makes it clear, something that needs to be internalized in our day and age. There are still prophets, sages, teachers. There's nothing in the Scripture that indicates that stopped at a particular time. And we do injustice to the Bible and to the words of Jesus when we say, well, that stopped after the apostles. There is nothing in Scripture that indicates that. Well, Jesus goes on and he says, verse 35 and 36, and so upon you will come all the righteous blood that has been shed on earth, from the blood of righteous Abel to the blood of Zechariah, son of Berechiah, whom you murdered between the temple and the altar. Truly, I tell you, all this will come on this generation. And what Jesus is saying is, there will come judgment from God over this generation, the generation of Jesus' day, that rejected the Messiah when he came, even though they had clear testimony from the prophetic scriptures of what the Messiah would be like, what he would do, what he would accomplish, what he would teach. All of those things were prefigured in the writings of the Hebrew prophets. Jesus says, therefore, you're going to be judged for all of it. From the blood of righteous Abel, Genesis chapter 4, verse 8, where Cain kills his brother Abel, and all the way down to the blood of Zechariah, son of Berechiah. There is a general consensus as to what this is all about. But there are a couple of issues here, and I feel it very important to mention them. The mention of blood of Abel to the blood of Zechariah is also given in the Gospel of Luke. Luke mentions the same thing. However, Luke does not say that Zechariah is son of Berechiah. And that's where a good deal of controversy has arisen. Many individuals will point to this and they will say, Matthew got it wrong. Because if he is referring to the blood of Zechariah, who was murdered between the temple and the altar, he is described in the book of 2 Chronicles as the son of Jehoiada. Now, again, the prevailing view of many today is Matthew got it wrong. I do not buy that. I'll be very upfront with you. I do not buy that at all. And there are two reasons for that. One of the reasons is, if you read carefully 2 Chronicles chapter 24, you will find that Jehoiada died at the age of 130. He was an extremely old man. Zechariah is called the son of Jehoiada in 2 Chronicles. However, many times in the scriptures, people are called the son of so-and-so, and they're the grandsons or the great-grandsons of that individual. There is a very real possibility that Matthew knew more than we do. I'm just going to say it. And Matthew may well have understood something that we do not find in the scripture, but that may very well have been known in his day, that the real father of Zechariah, the grandson of Jehoiada, was none other than Berechiah. There is another possibility, and that is that Zechariah, son of Berechiah, who is the author of the prophetic book, Zechariah, was actually himself murdered between the temple and the altar, but it's not recorded in Scripture. Those are the two possibilities. I lean toward the first, that this is referring to Zechariah, the son of Jehoiada and Berechiah, who is mentioned in 2 Chronicles. And the reason I hold to that is because it makes a lot of sense biblically. You know, the Hebrew Bible contains, this is a Jewish Bible here, the Tanakh, the Holy Scriptures. The Jewish Scriptures, the Hebrew Scriptures, contain everything that we have in our Old Testament. The only difference? They're arranged differently. Our Old Testament goes from Genesis to Malachi. The Hebrew Bible goes from Genesis to 2 Chronicles. And if you take a look at any Hebrew Bible, you will find, I don't know if you'll be able to see this, but you'll find the last book of the Hebrew Bible is 2 Chronicles. And what Jesus may well be doing is saying, everything in the Scriptures, all of the attack on the prophets of God that have gone on from the beginning of creation until this time, and Zechariah in 2 Chronicles is the last individual mentioned in Scripture to be killed, and is killed between the temple and the altar. And what Jesus is saying is everything from the beginning to the end of the prophetic Scriptures is going to come down on you. You will be judged accordingly. Those are horrific words. And it's just a very clear understanding and description of the magnitude of the sin of killing the Son of God. Well, Jesus continues, verse 37. He says, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, you who kill the prophets and stone those sent to you. How often I have longed to gather your children together as a hen gathers her chicks under her wings, and you were not willing. You sense here the incredible anguish of Jesus, the Son of the living God, the second person of the Trinity, who is saying, throughout the ages, I have longed to bring you to myself. You read the scriptures and you see how God constantly wants to bring his children back to him. And Jesus says, I have longed to gather you just like a hen gathers her chicks under her wings, and you weren't willing. And so Jesus says, look, your house is left to you desolate. Now, Jesus is using Jerusalem and the house as a symbol of the Israelite nation at that time, of especially the religious and political establishment, and specifically of the house, the temple, that everyone loved and boasted about and recognized as the holiest place in all of the world. Jesus says, your house is left to you desolate. And in light of what we're going to read in just a few moments, you will see how desolate that house is going to become. And so Jesus concludes, for I tell you, you will not see me again until you say, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Now those words, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord, in Hebrew, Baruch atah b'shem Adonai, they come directly out of Psalm 118. They are words that were spoken as Jesus came into Jerusalem on the day we call Palm Sunday. They are words that would have been sung by Passover pilgrims as they prepared to celebrate God's great deliverance of the children of Israel from bondage in Egypt. And Jesus says, you won't see me again until you finally say, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. There is a good deal of scriptural evidence to suggest what Jesus is saying is, he will not return until the Jewish people return. Until they return to their genuine Messiah, until they acknowledge him as the one who comes in the name of the Lord. And that is specifically spoken of in the book of Romans. In fact, in Romans chapters 9, 10, and 11, the Apostle Paul deals with his anguish over the fact that so many of his fellow countrymen and women, the Jewish people, so many of them did not receive Jesus as Messiah. And he states forthrightly that he would be willing to give up his own salvation if only they would come to the Lord. But then he makes this incredible prophetic word. In Romans chapter 11, verse 15, and then at verses 25 to 27, speaking of the Jewish people, he says, for if their rejection brought reconciliation to the world, in other words, if the fact that the Jewish people turned their backs on Jesus the Messiah, it opened up the gospel to go out to all the Gentile world, to all the non-Jewish world. As I've mentioned before, one of the fascinating things noted by great Jewish scholars over the centuries is that the Torah, the writings of Moses, they have been spread more by followers of Jesus than by anyone else, by far. But Jesus is saying, if the rejection of the religious leadership in general and other Jewish people in particular has brought what? Reconciliation to the world, what will their acceptance be but life from the dead? And I believe what Paul is talking about here, the natural understanding of his words is this. When they come back to him and say, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord, it brings the resurrection of the dead, the return of Christ. His desire is that Jew and Gentile alike be brought together in the family of God, and that there be a massive conversion in those last days. And then Paul goes on, verses 25 to 27. I do not want you to be ignorant of this mystery, brothers and sisters, so that you may not be conceited. And keep in mind, he's writing specifically to Gentile believers. He doesn't want them to be conceited in the fact that, hey, we've got the Messiah and they've rejected him. Israel has experienced a hardening in part until the full number of the Gentiles has come in. And in this way, all Israel will be saved. As it is written, the deliverer will come from Zion. He will turn godlessness away from Jacob. And this is my covenant with them when I take away their sins. That is a quote from the prophet Isaiah. And it foresees the day when the Jewish people return to the living God, return to Messiah, the one who is their, and I quote, deliverer who comes from Zion. When they come back to him, then he returns. I believe that is what the scriptures are talking about here. And I recognize there are some believers who would not hold to that understanding, but I would challenge them. Take a careful look. The Apostle Paul understood that the gospel was for the Jew first and then for the Gentile. And that's why even though he was called as the missionary to the Gentile world, he always went first to the synagogues. He always went first to the Jewish people. He always went to those who first received the very promises and incredible gifts of God. The day will come, I believe, when they come back. And for that, I pray all the time, including for friends of mine. Well, we come now to the next part of this discussion. As Jesus begins now, he has brought the woes down on the unbelieving religious establishment. And now he tells his disciples what lies ahead. He deals with the temple and with the last days. Matthew 24. We're going to take a look at the first part of that here this morning. Matthew 24, verses 1 and 2. Jesus left the temple and was walking away when his disciples came up to him to call his attention to its buildings. Jerusalem's temple was one of the most glorious structures, not just in the Middle East, but in the known world. It was an awesome structure. The temple sanctuary itself stood 150 feet high. It was made out of white limestone. It would glisten in the rising and setting sun. It was also covered in many places with gold plate. We are told that individuals who looked at the temple in the early morning as the sun was rising over the Mount of Olives had to avert their eyes because it was just so incredibly bright. The description that we have from Jewish authorities and authors indicates that the temple area itself was amazing, with beautiful structures, the incredible royal portico, the area where Jesus and later on the disciples themselves would teach along the eastern side of the temple grounds, the incredible court with columns 40 feet high and amazing works of art, incredible ornate designs. The disciples are looking at that, and you can almost see it in your own eyes. Their jaws are kind of slack as they say, "Look at this, Lord. Isn't this amazing?" Jesus says to them, verse 2, "Do you see all these things?" he asked. "I tell you, not one stone here will be left on another. Every one will be thrown down." And at that point, their jaws must have really dropped, because the idea that those stones could be torn down, that this majestic structure could be destroyed and completely leveled, seemed an impossibility. An impossibility at two levels. First of all, how would God allow that? And secondly, how could any human being accomplish that? It took so long to build this. These stones they weigh ton upon ton upon ton. How could that ever happen? As they look at that structure, they would have said to themselves, this is mind-boggling. This is, not only is this almost impossible for us to conceive, but if this were to happen, it would be such a tragedy in our lives. Today, we know that Jesus hit it right on the head, because the stones were cast down, not one on top of another, with all the gold plate on the temple. The temple was burned in the last days of the Jewish revolt against Rome. And when the Roman armies came to the temple, they actually tore the stones one from another to scrape the gold off. We know today that the gold that was confiscated from the temple was used to build, among other things, the Colosseum in Rome. Not one stone left on another. And Jesus, as he speaks to his disciples, says, this is what's going to happen. It would happen about 40 years after Jesus spoke these words. And Jesus then says this. As Jesus was sitting on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately. They say, tell us, when will this happen? And what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age? And so the question is a twofold question, and it's very important that we keep this in mind, because keep in mind this as well. What follows is some of the most controversial material in all of the New Testament. And devout believers have looked at this and come up with all sorts of different understandings. But it's especially important as we begin this discussion to remember the disciples ask two questions and Jesus answers those two questions together. The two questions are, when will the temple be destroyed? And what will be the sign of the end of the age, of the return of Christ, of what we would call the second coming? And it's at that point that Jesus answers them. And so we read Matthew 24, beginning at verse 4. Jesus answered, watch out that no one deceives you. For many will come in my name, claiming, I am the Messiah, and will deceive many. What Jesus is saying is, the signs of these last times, both of the destruction of the temple and of the end of time, is deception. People will be deceived. Watch out that no one deceives you, Jesus says. For many will come in my name, claiming I am the Messiah, and will deceive many. Jesus is saying, watch out, because deception is one of the clear signs of the end of days. And by the way, that is something that is echoed in the rest of the Scriptures. The Apostle Paul, for instance, writing to Timothy, reminds him of what it's going to be like in the last days. As people hold to a form of our religion but deny its real power, people are deceived. And so Jesus goes on. He says, you will hear of wars and rumors of wars, but see to it that you are not alarmed. Such things must happen, but the end is still to come. Now keep in mind, Jesus and the disciples were living in what has now been called the Pax Romana, the Roman peace. It was a time when warfare had really calmed down. There was general peace throughout the Mediterranean world. And Jesus says, one of the things you're going to hear about, wars and rumors of wars. And he says, that's just the beginning. The end is still to come. And then he says, nation will rise against nation and kingdom against kingdom. There will be famines and earthquakes in various places. All these are the beginning of birth pains. And so Jesus is talking about the fact that the signs, both of the destruction of Jerusalem appears and of the end of time, is there's going to be warfare, wars and rumors of wars, famines, earthquakes. Now, by the way, all of those things happened at the time of the Jewish revolt. There had been, prior to the revolt, a famine in Israel itself. And you will recall the Apostle Paul was one of those who sought to bring relief to those who were afflicted by the famine that had been predicted by a believing prophet by the name of Agabus. There were also earthquakes. We know of one earthquake from the book of Acts, for instance, that happened in what we call Greece today, when the Apostle Paul and his dear friend and colleague Silas were in prison in Philippi, and suddenly there was an earthquake. There are many other earthquakes that took place in the period before the destruction of the temple. But these things are also going on throughout human history. And they are signs that we're getting closer to the end. But the end is not yet, Jesus says. These are the beginning of birth pains. In other words, when birth pains begin, you know that the child is coming soon. You just don't know how long. And that's where we're going to stop today because our time is just about over. We're going to pick up there next time and talk about the birth pains because there is so much in that phrase, So much for us today.
Thanks so much for listening to Awake Us Now with Pastor Chris Dodge. Today's program was sponsored by Awake Us Now. We encourage you to learn more about God at our website, awakeusnow.com.